Now this big boy is my Powermatic PJ882 jointer. It has an 8-inch wide bed that's about 83 inches long, and that has plenty of support for those longer boards. And you can see mine is outfitted with a mobile base. Now one of the most common questions that I get from folks about jointers is whether they should go with a 6-inch model or an 8-inch model. Now typically bigger is better because you have more surface to run wider boards. If you use a smaller jointer, you have to cut your boards down into more narrow strips and then glue them back together for wider panels, which is never really fun. But for me, I found that 90%, 95% of my stuff that comes through the shop is between 6 and 8 inches wide. So I used to have the 6-inch version of this tool, and it was great. The problem was I wound up cutting an extra inch or two off of these boards that were just about 8 inches wide. So I figured the 8-inch jointer was the sweet spot because you go a little bit wider to 10 inches and it gets really, really expensive. I mean, 8 is expensive enough as it is, but I think that extra 2 inches in width is really going to help you over the 6-inch models. So my recommendation for most average woodworking shops, at least get the 6-inch, and if you can get bigger than that, go for 8-inch, and if budget isn't a problem or space isn't a problem, then certainly go even wider if you want to. Now, in order to understand the setup procedure for a tool like this, it's important to know what it is, how it works, and what it does. Now, the jointer in my shop, the primary purpose of the jointer is for milling stock. You can use it to cut things like rabbets and bevels and things like that, but honestly, I just never really find the need to do that. I use my router for most of that work. So primarily, all I want to do with my jointer is take a rough board and I create a nice flat face by passing it over the beds and over this cutter head that spins in between these two adjustable tables. Okay, so as you push it across, you'll see it starts to remove material and essentially flattens one face. Now once you have a flat face, you can use that for reference for the second step. The second step is to create a nice flat edge, but not just flat, we also want it to be perfectly 90 degrees from the surface that we just cleaned up. So I would do my first pass this way, and then I would take the newly cleaned face and put that up against the fence and run the edge across the blades that way, giving me that perfectly 90-degree corner. That's really all I'm going to do here at the jointer, because the next step would be to use the planer to clean the top surface and the table saw to clean the other edge and make it parallel to the first. So the jointer really, it doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? It's going to be used in conjunction with other tools to really get the most out of it. So it's time for a little anatomy lesson. The jointer really only has 4 parts that we need to be concerned with. You've got your in-feed table, your out-feed table, your cutter head in the middle, and your fence. Now the in-feed table is where we adjust how much material we're going to remove. For me personally, I don't like to remove much at all. I take very, very light passes because it gives me a cleaner cut. It just means I have to take more passes to get enough material off to consider a surface flat, and I'm okay with that. So typically, I just leave it locked in place and I don't really touch it very much. The outfeed table is something that we only adjust during the setup process. Once it's locked in place, in the proper place, we don't touch that at all. The cutter head, of course, is in the middle. You'll find a few different designs. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but what I have here is a straight knife cutter head, so very simple straight knife design. The fence moves in and out. It also tilts on an angle. And again, this is one of those things that you can get pretty fancy with some of the stuff you can do with the jointer, but me personally, I just leave it set perfectly 90 degrees with the table, call it done. Now for more information on how to actually use the jointer, check out one of our earlier episodes, The Jointer's Jumping. Go to thewoodwhisperer.com, click on the archive, and dig back into those earlier episodes and you'll find it. Now there are 2 primary setup procedures that we need to do to this jointer to make sure it works properly. First, we're going to look at the tables. The tables must be coplanar. To explain that, I've got a couple pieces of plywood here. Sometimes it's easier to see what is not coplanar to sort of understand what it actually is to be coplanar. These 2 pieces right now are not coplanar. Okay? If I do this, they're still not coplanar. When they're both on the same plane like this, that's when they're coplanar. They're nice and even, but don't be confused because they could still be offset. And in fact, with this tool, that's what we have to do. We have to make sure they're perfectly coplanar, and then later we're going to lower that in-feed table so we actually take a certain depth of cut. So of course, you want to unplug the tool. That should be common sense at this point. Remove the guard. This is one of the only times you're ever going to see me take this guard off of this tool. And since in a minute I'm going to be putting a metal straight edge over this surface, I want to make sure there's no chance that those blades are going to come in contact with my straight edge. So I'm going to raise my outfeed table up just by a hair, not much at all. There we go. And now anything I put across this surface should very easily clear those blades. It won't touch. Now you guys know that whenever possible, I try to give you the cheapest solution to a problem, or at least a cheap alternative and a different way to do it. When it comes to setting up a jointer, I've tried a number of different ways. I've tried a bunch of different gadgets. What I'm going to show you is the way that I found to be the easiest and that will ensure your success. The problem is the things that I use cost money. Primarily this straight edge is one of the biggest things that people have a hard time plunking down the cash for. This is a 50-inch straight edge. This one happens to be from Lee Valley. It cost about 80 bucks for this guy. Now you can find different ones on the market. You could just do a little bit of shopping and find them cheaper. But what you don't want to do is grab a level from the home center. Okay, those things generally are not going to be nearly as accurate as we need them to be for this operation. So kind of apologize ahead of time for not having a great cheap solution for this, but I know this system works, and you can use that straight edge on so many different things in the workshop, not just your projects, but setting up all your other tools. So it is a good investment. The other thing I'm going to recommend you get is a set of feeler gauges. Now, I'm not a feeler gauge kind of guy. I don't really like to get this picky about my tool setups, but when it comes to the jointer, a few thousandths can really make a difference, and a lot of people spend time frustrated, wondering why they are so terrible at jointing, and the reality is it's not even them, it's the tool setup. So if your tool isn't set up properly, you're just going to frustrate yourself and you're going to question your technique when in fact it's probably just the tool. So I do recommend getting a standard set of feeler gauges because they're going to help us with this process. Now here's the basic idea. You're going to take your straight edge and drop it on the outfeed table. And we want to make sure that we're referencing at all times from the outfeed table. So you could see how we might have a little bit of an issue if we want to get all the way to the end where we can detect the most error by having this all the way out there. We need something to keep pressure on the straight edge on this end. And I'll show you a little trick for that in a bit. But essentially what you need to know is that the infeed table is where all the adjustments are going to be made. I'm not making any adjustments to the outfeed table. So it depends on the type of joiner you have. It depends on the brand. There's a lot of factors that go into what you're going to have to do. So definitely consult your manual for the individual procedures of setting up and moving that infeed table. For me, I've got 4 cam adjustments. So I basically turn 4 bolts in 4 different locations, and what they do is they correspond to the 4 points of this surface. So I can tilt it one way or the other. It's actually really handy because if everything seems in alignment, but this corner here, let's say, is just a little bit too low, I can just raise that one up just a little bit. But keep in mind, every adjustment you make can affect the other 3. So you have to constantly go back and forth and keep checking all of these different locations until they're all close enough, let's say. They don't have to be perfect, but close enough, and we'll decide what is good enough when we get there. So the first thing I want to do is check the infeed table here closest to the cutter head. And that's very easy to do because all I have to do is place most of my straight edge here on the outfeed, and then I start taking measurements with my feeler gauges. Okay, so I have my straight edge toward the back of the jointer on the fence side, and I'm going to take my first measurement right here. So I have a 16 thousandths here, and that seems to slide pretty easily. Here's 18 thousandths. I can get it under there, but I can feel a lot of pressure. So it's somewhere between 16 and 18. I don't happen to have a 17 thousandths, but I would guess that that's probably about where it is. For now, let's just go for 16. What I'm going to do is use a little business card here to sort of represent the infeed table and the location of the 4 corners to show exactly where we're at. And it'll give me a little profile view of what we need to do. Okay, so 16 at that front corner. Let's test it up front here. 16, unfortunately, is a little tight. Let's look at 15. And 15 just barely gets under there. 14 is not so bad. You can see it gets hung up right here at the front. Now to take the measurements at the far end of the infeed table, it's going to be a little bit trickier because we need to get as much of this straight edge over there as possible while maintaining pressure down on this end. Now the way I'm going to do that is using a piece of wood here. I actually just looked around and I saw that I had these bow clamps in the shop and realized that these would be perfect. So really all you need to do is get a piece of hardwood and cut a groove down the middle that will hold your straight edge so it sits kind of like so. And the idea here is I could push my straight edge pretty far over and I could, whoops, obviously it's very easy to make it fall. And if I apply some clamping pressure back here, it's actually going to push down on the straight edge and keep it registered against the outfeed table, which is exactly what we want. The other thing you might want to do here, I've got my clamp, since the underside of this is relatively open under here, you might need a block of wood to give you a little bit more clamping support. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. And just like we took a measurement on one side and then the other side when we did the area nearest the cutter head, we're going to do the same thing on the other end. And I'm going to start close to the fence here. And you can see now this end is nice and secure. It's resting perfectly flat against the outfeed. And I've even got my 1,000th little feeler gauge here. And you can see even at 1,000th, it doesn't go under. So that's how we know that it's basically perfectly tight against the outfeed all the way across this surface. And now we can take our measurements. So we had 16 and 12 at the front. Let's go ahead and try the 16 back here. That slides with no problem. And in fact, I could already tell that we've got a lot of room to spare. That's 22 thousandths. 24 starting to catch. And 25 is 25 is our magic number here. So at the back end, we are 25 thousandths. Okay, let's check the front side. Now I move the clamp and straight edge to the front, and I can take my measurement. 24, just barely. Let's see if 25 is too tight. Well, 25 seems to make it under. So, final measurement, 25. All right, so now we've got a pretty good idea of what's going on with this infeed table. With a gap of 25 on this side and a gap of only 16 or 12 on this side, we know that the table is sagging this way. Okay, the tip of it is sagging down a little bit. So we're going to need to raise that up at some point. But there's one other thing that's bothering me that needs to be fixed first. That's the fact that we're 16 toward the fence and the gap is only 12 here at the front end. So we're going to need to make an adjustment there because I want those to be even first, and then I'll worry about the sag that might exist back there. Now this can be a pretty tedious process, so just want to warn you ahead of time that there have been times where this has taken me 4 to 5 hours to do. This could be an all-day event, depending on how lucky you get. The problem is the adjustments are very sensitive. Every time you move one point, you still affect the other three. So you have to be very careful, and it's literally adjust here, check the measurement, adjust there, check the measurement, and it's a back and forth thing. So take a few deep breaths, get a coffee, whatever it takes, just, approach it with a very relaxed mindset because you don't want to get frustrated by this. It's one of the worst feelings in the world when you can't get this thing set up properly. So just take your time. So the first thing I'm going to do is address these 2 points at the front and try and make them the same. Now it doesn't necessarily matter if I try to bring the 12 down a little bit so that it's also 16, or if I try to bring that back end up a little bit to bring that to 12. It doesn't really make that much of a difference. I want them to be the same bottom line. So let me get started making those adjustments. Now by turning this nut here, what that's going to do is make adjustments to a cam that's going to raise and lower this corner of the table. So you have to make very slight adjustments and check your progress. So let me do just that. And let's go to the 12 here. Okay, still tight at the front. 12 is loose in the back. That's to be expected. Let's make another little adjustment. Okay, 12 is getting looser. Still loose in the back. And what I'm doing is widening this gap, essentially lowering this corner. Okay, now the 12 is sliding freely. And let's grab our 14 here. Okay, 14 slides freely, and now let's check the 16. 16 gets under there, and it's under there in the back. I think I can go just a hair more. 16 slides, little resistance at the front, slides, and a little resistance at the front. Wow, that's pretty darn close. So now both at the front and back, we've got a nice 16 thou gap. So now this is where things can get really confusing, so you have to be careful. I know that the amount that it's sagging is even on both sides of the infeed table, so whatever change I make to one, I want to make that same change on the other side so I don't, get it all out of whack. Basically, I've got my 16th here, which we know is our clearance at the front, and obviously we have way too much clearance here at the back. So I'm going to give this guy a clockwise turn. That's going to close that gap a little bit, not as much as we need, but that's okay because I want to go in the back here and make a similar adjustment, and just, as close as you can, bring that up as well. We want to keep those as close to each other as possible, because I don't want to ruin the fact that I already went through all that work to get them perfectly even. Okay, so now you see what just happened. I made an adjustment on both of those ends. I brought the tail end up, but that didn't just affect those 2 points. It affected these points as well. So what was a nice snug fit with a 16,000th over here is now loose. Okay, it's loose all the way across. So because I've increased the overall gap, I need to switch to 18 thousandths now. Even 18 is loose. So that was a pretty dramatic change that we just did. You can see how this gets crazy if you're not careful. Here's 20. Okay, now 20 tightens up here and is still a little bit loose there. So we can make another adjustment. Very slight now, because we're really getting close. Now let's see what happens with the 20 again. Just barely slides under, and just barely slides under. So that's pretty close. So that's good for the front measurement. Now I need to move my clamp and the straight edge to the back, and I'll kind of do the same thing. With any luck, those adjustments that I made, trying to keep pace with the changes I made at the front, hopefully those adjustments were pretty close to perfect, so I don't have much to do back there. But we'll see. If we got lucky, it'll be dead on. If not, we're going to have to do a couple rounds back and forth until we get this perfect. All right, so checking it with the 20,000th. Now we're doing the back end of the table. Now it's a little bit tight here, and it feels pretty good back there. This is close. This is actually the fastest I've ever gotten to this point. I mean, we're talking a very, very slight variance. That's a little bit tight there, but it still slides under. It slid under at the front, but it was a little bit of a looser fit. Now, just from experience, because I've done this enough times, I can probably guesstimate that we're talking maybe a thousandth, even less, maybe a half of a thou difference between the back end and the front end here. Now, the question is that worth messing with? And in most cases, I'm going to say no, it's not. Because remember, as soon as you mess with one of these things, you start to mess with all of them. So the offending corner is this guy right here, and I'm gambling that if I make a slight adjustment, that it's going to move it a half, a thousandth of an inch. That is very difficult to do. So to be quite honest, if the 20 slides under snug at all 4 points here, that's good enough for me, and I think I'm going to call it a day right there. I lucked out today. Now, although I got very lucky today, chances are the next time I do this, I won't be so lucky. And chances are you won't be either. A lot of times it's a back and forth thing that lasts quite a while. So what would happen if it wasn't perfect? Let's say I had a little bit too much of a gap here and it was a little too tight at the front. It's very likely that that would be the case. I'm just going to make my adjustment to the nut that's in the back, and it's going to bring this corner up just a hair. And I try to get those two perfectly even, just like I did before at the front here. Once those two are even, I'm not out of the woods yet, because I still need to bring the straight edge back to the front edge of the joiner and check those two measurements up front. They could have moved. So if they're perfect and everything responds and has the same gap all the way around on all 4 points, then I'm done. Now the question will come up, how far to go? Like how close is good enough? To me, 1 to 2 thousandths at each point is good enough. So if you could slide the 20 under here, but the 20 is just a little bit tight here, that's only a half thou, maybe a thousandth at the most. I'm okay with that. As soon as you get to 2, 3, 4 thousandths, that's when things start to go a little bit off for me. So I aim for 1 to 2 at the most as a level of error for this. The bottom line is as soon as we start using this, we put big planks of wood on there, stresses on the table. Things are going to move over the course of time, but we want them to be as close as possible to perfect at the beginning so that we can extend the amount of time before we need to do this again. Usually, when I change my blades, I'm going to do it all over again anyway, so at least once a year I'm doing this procedure. Now the next step is to adjust the knives in the cutter head so that they are perfectly even and at the same height as the outfeed table. But before we do that, let's hear what Nicole has to say about the history of joiners.
According to the Old Woodworking Machines Wiki, the joiner was invented in 1866 when a patent was filed by John Riley and Henry Clymer. The patent described a pair of adjustable tables separated by a cutter head. Riley and Clymer sold the design to a company known as Bentel, Margaret & Company, who brought the unique design to life in the form of the Universal Woodworker. This was essentially the first official power joiner.
Now we're on to the second part of the setup process, and that is taking care of these joiner knives. This can be really intimidating for people because you have to get those knives set perfectly even with the outfeed table. And maybe if you get it done once, maybe you get lucky, you still have to do it 2 more times. So it's not about luck, it's about getting down to a system that actually works every single time, and it's down to a science. So I want to show you a couple different methods of doing it, but first let's talk about what most manuals recommend. A lot of times they will recommend using some sort of a dial indicator or something for a very accurate way of doing it, but they also recommend a very low-tech way, and that typically involves using some sort of wood block, or maybe the joiner actually came with a setup block made out of aluminum. And the idea is you put it over the cutter head, manually rotate the cutter head, and you sort of just measure the amount of movement of that block for one rotation, sort of tells you how high that blade is sitting. I don't really think that's a very accurate way to do it. I don't really recommend doing that. What we're going to do is use a jig. This really requires exact settings, and sometimes jigs are really the only way to get you there. But the problem is there are a lot of jigs on the market, so which one is the right one to use? Well, you know what? Sometimes I've got to make sacrifices for the show, and I went and bought 4 new toys to play with here. In fact, actually 3 of them are new. 1 is something that I've already had. But I'm going to get into the details of these. I want to actually set my joiner up 4 different times and show you the process and how it works, and then I'll just give you my opinion on which one I think is probably going to be the most worthy of your hard-earned money. These are not cheap, I'll warn you ahead of time. So let's get into it. We'll start off with the one that I have been using for years now, and that's called the Joiner Pal.
The Joiner Pal is a very simple system that utilizes rare earth magnets to bring the blades up to the level of the outfeed table. To use it, you need to find a top dead center of the blade's path. I use a piece of tape and a pencil to mark my best estimation. Simply line up the jig with the line on the fence and loosen your blades. The magnet should pull them up and hold them in place as you tighten the blades back down. The one-way multi-gauge is a simple and sturdy dial indicator that gives you an accurate measurement of your blade's height. Rotate the cutter head back and forth to get a precise reading, and use the screws under the blades to raise and lower the blade as needed. The Align It kit works on the same principle as the one-way, with a slightly different form factor. And finally, the MLCS 9327. This is another magnetic system, only this one bridges the infeed and outfeed tables and lets you make micro adjustments to the blade height.
So this was an incredibly fun little experiment. I'm really glad I did it because I've had a change of heart. For a long time, you guys know that I try as hard as I can to avoid using things like dial indicators, feeler gauges when possible. Now you saw me use feeler gauges on setting up the tables for alignment, and we've got some dial indicators here that we're playing with. And if I could avoid using them, I'm going to, but man, now that I've used it, it really has affected how I feel about my trusty old joiner pal. So let's start out with this guy. It's all based on the magnets, and really the blade should be dead level with the table in theory. The problem is, as you tighten that blade down, we know it's going to raise up a little bit, and even despite this relatively strong magnet, it still moves up. And you have no way of controlling it, and you have no way of stopping it, you have no way of measuring it. So what I did was, after I did all three, which by the way takes about 3 minutes per blade, so less than 10 minutes is your setup time if you're doing all three of your blades from scratch. I took my gauges that I now have, my dial indicators, and I just wanted to see what the variance was from side to side and from blade to blade. And I'm looking at between anywhere from 1 to 4 thousandths from one side of the blade to the other. Some of them came out even. One of them was 1 thousandth up on the one side and 4 thousandths on the other. So the problem is, it's a little bit unpredictable. You can get close, but you're not going to get perfect. Now, the truth is, I've been using this thing for years, and I've had decent results. My work wasn't adversely affected by it in any major way. So this is an adequate option. But if you want to get better, and you want better results, and you want to ensure that all of your blades in your jointer are doing the work and they wear evenly, you may want to try something else. But reasonably priced, the cheapest model is $27. They get pretty expensive if you want a really wide one, but they range for the 6 to 8 inch models. For 6 to 8 inch jointers, you're looking at $27 to $80 for the Joiner Pal. Now, very similar to the Joiner Pal because they're based on magnets, but a little bit more sophisticated in what it's trying to do, is the MLCS 9327, which just rolls off the tongue. These things run for $70, and I got to say I'm kind of disappointed in these. I really, when I saw them, I was like, great. I've got the functionality of the Joiner Pal, only now I can actually micro adjust by turning these little knobs left and right. Well, the problem is, how do you know how much to move it? If you don't have a dial indicator on that blade, how do you know how much you're bringing it up and down? The other thing is, it's a plastic body. The magnets aren't quite as strong as something like the Joiner Pal, and I think part of it is the form factor because it's, you've got a large top on here. It's very easy to move. The problem is those blades are still going to be able to move this thing up and distort it a little bit. It's not really locking it down. So we still have the same fundamental problem that we have with the Joiner Pal in that little bit of movement. Now, if I know that one side is up 4 thousandths, let's say, and the other side is down at 1 thousandth, I can adjust this to get it down, and I can make little micro adjustments. But if I don't have a dial indicator on there, how do I know? So the reason I'm going to give this a fail is because you need something else with it. I just don't see how this is going to work as a standalone item. So kind of neat, but I don't know that it's good for what we're trying to do here. So choosing between these two bad boys, that's a little bit of a different story. You've got a decision to make here. If you're the type who wants a all-in-one tool that's going to do everything, it may not be the very best at each one of those tasks, but it's certainly going to be very good. I would say the Align It kit is the way to go. But if you're the type of person who wants the absolute best tool for that job, the One Way, hands down, is my favorite in this whole test. It's just so beefy, so rugged. I think I'm in love with this thing. I can't wait to set up my planer with it because it's going to make it so much easier. Same thing with my drum sander. I think primarily those are the 3 tools I'm going to use this on, but those are some of my most used tools in the shop. And if those aren't set up right, it can make your life miserable. So for me, the One Way is definitely the way that I'm going to go in the future. But again, I can't say that the Align It is, well, it's really a close second. I mean, it really did a great job setting up the jointer. I just think that this is a little bit better at this particular task. So kind of a toss-up between the two, and it's going to depend on your personal situation with what you want. But for me, I love this thing. So now that I've picked my favorite, I'm going to give you a little bit more detail on how to set that blade up using a dial indicator. So I want to start by loosening up the blade. Be very careful when you do this. Just be very aware of the path of your hands. So let's pull the blade out, put that on the side, get this guy out of here. Now, a lot of jointers will have springs in them underneath the blade, and it keeps the blade pushing upward. Now, that's very handy when you're doing the magnetic jig because it helps the blade go up until you tighten it down. In this case, if we're going to use a dial indicator, that's actually going to work against us. It's going to be a real problem, so I'm removing mine. And inside here, you'll see a little adjustable screw. And what this screw does is it rests against the bottom of the blade and sort of determines where that blade is going to sit. So you could make very slight adjustments and raise and lower the blade. Pop this guy back in place. And you may want to lower those just a little bit. I'd rather start with them low than start with them too high. Slide our blade in place. So I just make all of these just to the point that they're snug. I'm not actually turning them with the wrench. I'm just kind of smacking the bolt here until it contacts the back wall of the cutter head. And that's a nice snug fit. So the blade is as far down as it's going to go. You may even want to use something to protect your fingers. These little rubber sanding pads I find are pretty good for this because I can push directly on the tip and not really have to worry about my thumb getting cut. You still obviously want to be very, very careful when you do this, but you want to put downward pressure on here so that it doesn't move when we start to tighten these things up. So first things first though, we need to see how far off we are at this point. And we're just under the 0 point here. And what I'm primarily concerned with is I want to see if we're even on both sides. Okay, this side seems like it's a tad bit lower. Okay, so now we're going to start making adjustments. The easiest way I find to do that is keep the 3 in the middle, and yours may be a little bit different, but you'll get the idea. Keep the middle bolts loose and start to snug up the ones on the outside. Right here is the point that I feel it catching, and you can see how much I turned it. It's really not a whole lot, but just enough to snug it up so it's not going to slip around. I'm going to do the same thing on the one in the very back. And now what I can do, start back here first, try to find the highest point. It's almost hitting 0. So I'm going to turn the screw here counterclockwise. It's going to be a little bit tough to turn because I did tighten up that blade a little. But as I turn it, watch what happens. You see, we're approaching 0, we're on 0, and now we actually went too far. Okay? So the problem here is if you go too far, we introduced a little bit of friction here and tension, so it's not going to go back down unless I push it down. So I'm going to have to loosen this up, so that's why you have to be careful not to go too far. It's always easier to raise the blade than it is to lower it again. We'll put that screw down again, and we'll make sure that we push the blade all the way down. And we should be below 0 again, which is good. Now I'm going to snug this one back up again. Put the gauge back in place. And we will be very careful. This is not a micro adjustment here, so you have to be careful how much you turn it. And I just want to hit the point that basically the needle touches 0. There we go. I feel pretty comfortable with that. Let's see how we're doing near the front here. So I'm going to turn the bolt now counterclockwise and see if we can't get this front end to be up to 0. And there we go. So I left these 3 loose because if I made adjustments to the outside while these were also snugged up, what can actually happen is you could sort of torque the blade and create a little bit of a dished effect where it will stay low in the middle and move up because we forced the outside edges up. So I like to keep those middle ones loose until I'm at this point where I'm really comfortable with where everything is. Now, I don't know if you necessarily have to do this, but I do like to put some downward pressure on that blade when I start to snug these things up because inevitably, as you tighten them, you are going to raise that blade just a little bit. And really, it's a matter of getting used to how your jointer responds to this because it may go up 1,000th, it may not go up at all, it could go up 3,000. So you have to see what you're up against. So in the back, we're looking at 1 thou, maybe 1.5. That's pretty darn good. I like that. Let's look at the front. At the front, we've got 1.5. Okay, excellent. So what I can do now is really bear down on these and give them a good, nice, tight fit. So if you've been paying attention up to this point, you're probably wondering why I'm okay with that blade being 1.5 thousandths higher than the outfeed table. Previously, I was saying you want to make it dead even. Well, when we're talking about thousandths, for all practical purposes, it is dead even, but you really do want it to be just a hair higher than the outfeed table. In the past, there are times when I've used the magnetic method to keep it perfectly even with the outfeed, and the results were I just wasn't getting an effective joining operation out of it, and I tinkered with the outfeed table, moving it up and down, and when it was just a hair lower than the blades, all of a sudden, everything just worked. Well, the more I looked into it, then I found out people were recommending that those blades need to be just a little bit higher than perfect level. So that's what I would recommend. Try to aim between 1 and 2 thousandths higher than the outfeed table if you can. Obviously, you need a dial indicator to do that level of accuracy. You're just not going to be able to do that with a magnetic system. So, that's why I'd like to, when I first snug up the bolts, I like to set them at 0, knowing that my jointer, as I tighten that up, I know that those blades are actually going to come up a little bit. So it really is important that you know how much yours are going to move. And once you're kind of familiar with it, you can sort of adjust for it. So if mine moved up 4 and I want to end up at 1, I should probably make sure that my blades are registering below 0 when I get them set up. And that way when I tighten them up, they'll move perfectly up to 1.
When a patent was Margarite. I'm talking in my fancy voice. What? The joiner was invented. Hold on, let me fix my hair. Because you wanted some outtakes.
Yeah.
Well, there you have them.